Okay, I want to start the talk today by making a claim, a very simple claim, that it's the advent of the approach of what is generally known as design research, and I'm looking specifically at design research and architecture. I know that the course here probably has a broader remit, but I'm coming from an architectural background. But certainly if you look at it within the architectural context, it strikes me that there's been a sea change really in what's been happening within architectural thinking because of the advent of design research. And to many of us, it kind of offers the first chance, really, the first coherent chance really to create not only what we call research-based design, but also research-based practice. And so there's hopefully a coming together between these two areas which have been slightly disconnected for too long. And also specifically, I think it enables us to be able to reintroduce or to bring into the fold a political approach to architecture, a sort of an approach which has really been sort of undervalued, I would say, for the last 20 years. There used to be an older model which was based on a belief in Britain on the participation in the welfare state, etc. As the welfare state breaks up, the idea of a sort of a collective political purpose in architecture starts to disappear. But I think now there seems to be, to me, at least another enough kind of subcurrents of new themes coming through, and I think design research offers a great chance to do that. What I'll do today is I'll just talk through a few examples of practitioners who are involved, I think, very much in this change. And these will deliberately mix those who are perhaps seen as being at the more speculative end, the people who are doing the more visionary, so often called paper architecture type projects, and also people who are actually engaged in practice, building new projects, etc. So try and put those two together. And then I'll also probably end by just talking about a group that I'm involved in called the Palestine Regeneration Team, which I set up with my colleagues Yara Sharif and Nasser Grozari, and I'll show you some of the work, the approach that we've been doing for projects in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So I'll just show you some examples of this as well. But it struck me as this, to just start off, it'd be worthwhile giving you a definition. The definition that I used in this book, which I sort of edited a book for the Ashgate series that Jonathan mentioned. And the Ashgate series is really about actual practitioners and academics doing the research, etc. But we put together an edited book as a sort of an overview, as a kind of start-up volume, a series of essays by people involved in this area from around the world. And in that, I give it this sort of working definition that architectural design research can be described as the processes and outcomes of inquiries and investigations in which architects, and again, I'm looking pretty much at the architectural side of things, use the creation of projects or broader contributions towards design thinking as a central constituent in a process which also, and this is really important also involves the more generalized research activities of thinking, writing, testing, verifying, debating, disseminating, performing, validating, etc., etc. So this design becomes a central component, but it must combine a number of these other kind of aspects as well. So it becomes a much more rounded, a much more kind of fulsome kind of definition of design research. This interaction between these different modes, etc., and between the sort of the designing, the writing, the thinking, and all the other things there, etc., have to happen as a sort of symbiotic relationship all the way through the process, from the start right through to the end. It's not just something that starts at the beginning like some kind of research and development phase and then sort of lapses more into normative practice. This is a kind of a symbiotic relationship that goes all the way through the process. I cover more of this in the book here, and if you're interested in people who are beginning to write about this kind of subject, there's a number of people contributing to this book, and obviously there are others coming out now as well. But I think the kind of thing is that we've got to always hold on to as well is that we're aware of the fact that architecture contains many diverse strands to it, etc. And there's always been worried about how it combines these different aspects, the more artistic, creative side, the social research side, the technological side, etc., the practice-based side, etc., how these go together. And it strikes me that this is really one of the tasks that design research can perform, is to find means to actually make these different aspects or different disciplines within architecture work together more coherently, etc. And then the result of this, if you take this kind of approach, is that it also calls for what I would say is a more sort of Catholic and tolerant notion of what sort of design research is and what research is altogether. And if there's been a criticism of the people who previously tried to write about the idea of research taking place within architecture, they've tended to be too limited in how they define it, etc. And they've also tended to be too defensive, that somehow architecture has to meet expectations from elsewhere rather than looking to what actually makes it research within its own terms, etc. And then I think it's, again, very important to say that I'm making this a claim not just on sort of pedagogic and kind of and aesthetic reasons and all the other reasons that we enjoy and we take part in architecture, but also really very much from a kind of questioning of the role and the status of architects politically and economically and culturally as well. So this is a real kind of thing that not only just looks at the kind of the contents of what we produce through research, but actually turns the spotlight as well, the gaze onto how we act in the world as well. So this becomes a sort of a complex process, etc. So really what I want to do is just talk through some of the kind of examples. The first example I found of an explicit mention of the term design research, and other people might know more than this, but the first time somebody actually writes those words and kind of means roughly what we mean today, was a Finnish American emigre architect called Elio Saarinen, writing in 1943 in a book called The City, in which he adds a postscript, really talks about the processes of designing how one designs a city, etc. But that's sort of born out of this kind of wartime, I think, mentality, research mentality, etc. It was very, again, quite limited in really how you imagined the application of that notion of design research. It was about sort of generally problem solving to suit a particular purpose. But really, I think probably the first architect, I think, really kind of, sort of begins to really understand the sort of a more broader, more nuanced and more kind of cultural and social kind of role of design research, I would argue, was Cedric Price, shown here. And Cedric Price was one of those sort of canonical figures of the 1960s, 70s, and then into 80s and 90s British architecture, who was seen very much as somebody who was not so interested in the kind of the profession per se, etc., but in about this whole questioning the whole notion of architecture. Came up with a number of very kind of remarkable projects, etc., but really saw every project as a research base. I've been spending some time in the Canadian Centre of Architecture, which has got the Cedric Price archives these days, and it's quite remarkable to look at how Cedric Price from the 60s was actually engaging with his kind of work. Each project becomes a major research investigation which covers all the range of different aspects, from aesthetic and cultural and social through to philosophical, scientific, etc. So there was a sort of model there. He was also somebody who saw architecture as having a very direct political role, etc. He argued that architects were too passive, they just waited for jobs to come from clients, etc., and just did whatever the kind of the forces of power wanted at a particular point in time. He argued that architects could reconceive what they did, change their kind of role in the relationship, and become much more proactive in conceiving new ideas and effecting change in society, etc. So he was one of the key figures of the UK anti-apartheid movement as well. So you can see a lot of a later photograph here, etc. But so you have somebody in Cedric Price who begins to see, I think, the possibilities of this kind of alternative model of architecture, which is not so tied to political, so economic and so political exigencies, etc. And this kind of approach, I think, then the next figure I would sort of point out, quite generally starting his career a lot later, was Lebbeus Woods, who's an American architect. Again, somebody seen who's as soon as involved more in the kind of the theoretical paper-based kind of part of architecture, produced a number of stunning projects, generally drawings and models, etc., in the late 80s into the 90s, etc., but always of a very specific political purpose, really commenting on the kind of aspects, the role of kind of new technologies, the kind of the need for a more democratic understanding of what was then called cyberspace and digital design, etc., and then also a kind of a sense of the way in which politics and the forces of power create through various situations. And he was very interested in the way in which kind of wars, etc., acts of destruction, looking particularly at, for instance, the wars in the Balkans in the 90s, etc., and how these also opened up spaces of possibility, how there was kind of a room for sort of kind of a reformulation of the kind of conditions that were given by the real forces of power at the time, etc. So you have somebody like Lebbeus Woods, etc. And then, of course, so this is just, and it strikes me that if you're looking at, so Lebbeus Woods was very concerned about ideas of the politics, the geopolitics at the time, and computing, etc. This is a rather long quote here, but this is part of an essay I wrote called The 50% Profession, which was published in the AD as part of a kind of a special edited issue. And really, it just points out, this is a quote from a journalist about something that the various kind of UN bodies and other bodies have been pointing out. And it's really strikes me as at the heart of one of the major challenges, I think, for architecture today, etc. Something that doesn't normally get talked about. If you pick up any kind of architectural journal, etc., you won't generally see any of this mentioned. Jonathan mentioned the idea of Pritzker Prize going to Alejandro Aravena, etc. So there are changes coming through, etc. But what this quote points out is that because of the new realities of the world economic system, you're really evolving in many countries, and you could also see it happening within Europe as well, as a system whereby, broadly speaking, the same half the world's workers are going to be working in future, currently are, and in the future will be working in low-paid, kind of low-status, impermanent jobs, etc., living in unofficial settlements, etc., having none of the kind of the benefits, etc., none of the securities, etc., that the other half of the population have. And if you think about what architects have actually been doing historically, is that we serve the half with the regular jobs and with the homes and with the pensions and all the other securities, etc. There's a whole spectrum of society which, if you look at, it's called mainstream architecture, are just completely left out from this. And so if this is really the reality, the socio-economic reality for the world, for the future, how does architecture respond to this? How do we actually then reconceive our subject within this? Do we, as I say in the essay, do you just accept you become a 50% profession, that you essentially only serve half of the human race, or do you rethink what you're doing? So this strikes me as a kind of a real kind of urgency that's coming through now, and then we've seen so many examples of those in which there are different forms of kind of building, different forms of urban settlement, etc., arising around the world, etc. And then how does architecture, how do we reconceive our subject through that? And it strikes me that this is something like the design research, the kind of fluidity, the openness that design research has within that. But there are obviously kind of people, useful people, who have been thinking about these things for a long time, dealing with these issues. And in this, I would recommend, if you haven't read them already, I'd recommend you read somebody called Nabil Hamdi, who is one of my ex-colleagues from Oxford Brookes University. He's now emeritus, he's retired, etc. But he's written a number of kind of books over the years, etc., of which possibly the most provocative one, the most interesting, very short, very, 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 very to the point read, is Small Change, etc. And he argues through that this idea of needing to have sort of established forces of power enacting building projects and needing lots of money and lots of organisation isn't actually necessary. That the most effective way of changing in societies, etc., at all levels, is through what he calls small change. So these much more pinpointed, light on the feet, new, bottom-up, grassroots kind of organised kind of events there, etc. So his book's really kind of a sort of theoretical reading of that, etc., and also an argument for this as well. And he says small change because this can be done without the millions typically spent on programmes and projects. And so if you're looking at a condition in which there is possibly going to be an increased division of wealth, a kind of a increasingly unfair division of wealth, maybe we need to start thinking about the kind of implications of this kind of thinking in terms of what we do in terms of design. And there are architects who are, and people involved in architecture who are actually taking up this challenge, and I've been working for it for a while. I found one of the most interesting is a guy called Teddy Cruz, who's Guatemalan by background, but essentially American by adoption. But his practice and his teaching takes place in San Diego. And it really looks at that, so the cross-cultural conditions over the American and Mexican border, etc. And he works really largely with kind of community groups in Tijuana and all the other areas where there's this kind of very, very liberal kind of mixing, shall we say, of all the cultural and economic forces. And here are examples like American Cape Park houses being brought back to Tijuana and turned into second-story dwellings, etc. And there's this kind of sort of ad hoc appropriations of cultures, etc., looking at people those kind of movements. And his kind of projects are really about, I mean, in some ways, you know, Andrew Aravind has been given the Pritzker Prize, but, you know, Teddy Cruz has been doing this kind of work, probably more interestingly, and probably overall for a while. So he's like another figure in that mold there, etc. Coming up with sort of ideas for kind of community-activated projects in which, by bringing in the sort of the skills and abilities and desires of the local community, you can start to build up a kind of a richer kind of form of architectural expression, one which kind of builds upon the kind of notion of self-build, etc. And again, this is a rather long quote from Teddy Cruz from his essay. He wrote an essay in the book. He's also one of our series editors, was sort of a slightly remote editor, but I mean, he wrote a fantastic essay in the book, etc. And I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just read the last part. And it's really about kind of a cri de coeur, this idea that, you know, that you can actually have a very ambitious architecture approach, a very, very strong aesthetic purpose, a very, very strong cultural purpose as well, and also deal with these kind of political subjects and actually deal with the kind of so we see some of the more pressing demands of society today. And he wrote, so I'll just read the latter part of it because it's really quite good. He says, "We need to move beyond the abstraction of the global in order to hit the ground and engage the particularities of the political that's inscribed within local geographies of conflict. To be political in our field, it means architecture, means a commitment to revealing the particular conditions of conflict inscribed in the territory and the institutional mechanisms that have perpetuated such conflicts." So there's a very sort of clear calling on architects really to think about what they're doing through their kind of activity, through their action. If you're going to propose projects, if you're going to make propositions in these areas, you really have to look much more carefully at the political and all the other constructs that have made those conditions like they are, etc. So Teddy organizes a number of kind of things, events, etc. This is a kind of a series of events he does where he gets permission to open up the infamous kind of border fence between America and Mexico. I mean, Donald Trump would be planting mines down both sides and putting all that kind of stuff. You know, Teddy Cruz thinking probably better to allow people to come across, to allow these kind of moments of kind of breaking down this kind of connections there, etc. So this is part of the thing. It's about organizing a kind of event. And this is a kind of, sorry, you won't be able to see it from back there, but I mean, this is kind of an ideogram of the kind of his kind of process of working from this general analysis through the community kind of activism, etc., working with local communities to get there. A lot of the work is also looking at things like legal rights, etc., land ownership, etc., government subsidies, etc., trying to help connect people up with the kind of the mechanisms of kind of economics that might help them to actually fund and run their own projects, etc. So quite a lot of it is at that level. Other ones there are more about the you know, the kind of ways in which you can sort of have building processes and kind of designs that evolve over time and again allow for some kind of permutations and reshaping from the local communities themselves, etc. And again, sort of projects here which are kind of are really about but one of the important things there, and I'll come back to this when I talk about the Palestine as well, but one of the kind of key things we think about architecture is not a passive container. We don't just design buildings and then they become sort of mute things or get handed over to something else. Those buildings, through their lives, etc., will have a definite impact on the living conditions of a whole range of people in that area, etc. So it's very important he thinks about things like economic opportunities, how you might use buildings and the building process itself to give people skills, to help them to set up businesses, to help them to create their own economic livelihoods, etc., form their own kind of social groupings, etc. And this is something also, if you've heard of Doina Pretresco, she's doing really interesting work in the suburbs of Paris, really about this idea of using architecture not just as a thing, as an object, etc., but also as a process which actually helps with a number of other kind of aspects of life as well. So you have somebody like Teddy Cruz. I mean, I also think of things really, another fascinating figure, Shigeru Ban. Somebody comes from a very sort of different kind of tradition, from a sort of a Japanese background, etc., and produced a number of kind of remarkable projects. Very interested in the use of kind of everyday common materials, quite often materials that would not be seen as architectural materials, and how these might be incorporated in designs, etc. And he did a number of projects, but this is probably one of the ones I think it's really quite sort of remarkable, and again shows you the way in which somebody like Shigeru Ban, like Teddy Cruz, Shigeru Ban is somebody also who really fundamentally researches into a whole host of different kind of areas in his practices. Practice is rather small. It kind of does a lot of work with what might be called low cost or pro bono kind of work, etc. And this is a project for after the earthquake in New Zealand in Christchurch, when basically there was a kind of huge loss of property and loss of life, etc. The cathedral broke down, and Christchurch is going through a terrible time at the moment. It's a relatively wealthy country, New Zealand, but this is an earthquake prone zone, etc. It's had tremors since then, etc. It's very hard for Christchurch to attract any form of investment now. It's lost of at least 10%, if not more, of its population, etc. So this is a town that's really kind of, in a very, very precarious way, which might otherwise seem quite prosperous, etc. So this is the idea of replacing the collapsed Christchurch Cathedral, which was an old neo-colonial building, by a new cardboard cathedral, etc. So the idea is, how could you very quickly and rapidly, with something, this is analysis of roughly the same kind of dimensions as the whole thing. You can't see this here because of the projector, but anyway, there's the old cathedral at the top, and then this is the new cathedral there. How you could build something that's low cost, fast to build, etc., and lightweight, etc. And so he uses a technique which has been developed for a long time of concrete-filled cardboard tubes. So these giant cardboard tubes, etc. There is other kind of forms of structure in there to hold up there, etc. But using a very sort of lightweight construction technique there. These are the model photographs, but the actual building as it was completed was pretty much the same as this as well. And so there's a really kind of, it's very simple construction logic, but a really kind of beautiful internal aesthetic, which also manages to relate to the form of the church, etc. So it seems to fit its symbolic purpose as well. But this is kind of an example of an architect. When you think about it, if this was kind of a situation which seems like, and this building's only meant to have a 20, 30-year life. If it collapses in an earthquake, the idea is that it could be rebuilt, really quickly as well. So you have a building that's both sort of kind of temporary, and it meets those kind of low cost, etc., but still also manages to have a presence about it within that, etc. And if you think about this, this idea of coming up with a kind of solution like this and a kind of strategy like this that goes all the way through from the technical through to how it then performs as a church, and then also it carries cultural meaning, is something that really kind of a sort of a research-based architecture approach can come up with. This is a kind of a solution where I thought it following any of the other kind of logics of how you reconstruct after natural disasters would never have ever happened, etc. And also, interestingly, it builds upon his previous work that Shigeru Ban worked for a few of the post disaster rebuildings in Japan as well, so and other countries in the East, etc. So this idea of developing these kind of low-cost but elegant kind of temporary housing in emergency situations. So you have somebody there sort of doing it within a very sort of different context, but doing there. So I thought what I'll do now is just talk about the kind of work we've been doing in Palestine as well, just to give you a kind of a sense of the way in which we kind of see the kind of role of what we can actually do within a particular context. Through our kind of work, which is very much conceived as research-based. We're not really conventional architects. We're not running architectural projects, etc. We're part of a much more complex, bigger team in a very, very sort of difficult situation, etc. But we feel we can argue and we can make kind of contributions, etc. through our kind of processes of research and testing, etc. So as I said before, it's Yara Sharif, Nasser Ghazari, and myself, and this is a map of Israel/Palestine, and basically the red areas is an NGO conservation body called REWAC, which has been working mainly in the West Bank since the 1990s, etc. Obviously, with a large amount of bombing and shelling and military action, etc. A lot of the kind of buildings have been destroyed, etc. Particularly in Gaza, which is down there, which is just about the toughest place you can imagine to even conceive of conservation or architecture. But most of the kind of the surviving Palestinian built heritage is on the West Bank side over there in the red there. And so REWAC, this conservation body, came up with the idea is that if they could name 50 key towns and villages, and these are generally the smaller towns and villages, not the big cities like Ramallah. They run under their own jurisdiction, but these are the smaller towns, etc., where there's still some examples of pre-1948 kind of Palestinian heritage still there. And so the idea is that if you could just buy one, it's like a bit like a leap of imagination. If you could just gradually over the years restore these properties and reuse them and find ways to regenerate these smaller towns and villages, you would be able to conserve something like 80% of the surviving Palestinian-built heritage in a situation where it's been increasingly erased. So this is one project. This is the first project we started on, and essentially, so REWAC were going to do this project, etc. And they came to us through Yara Sharif, who's Palestinian, who'd worked for them before. She was a PhD student of mine, etc. And we got talking about this thing, and they said, well, we got this money, and they get their money from the Swedish Overseas Development Aid, SIDA, so it's kind of it's money being given by international aid from Sweden, etc. But they got this kind of money, and they generally restore these older buildings and reuse them, generally repurposing them as things like museums and cultural centres and things like that. And they came to us and said, well, we've got this kind of project for Bristol, which is a university town quite close to Ramallah, and they said, could you set up a group just to talk about what we might be doing instead, you know, what other things might we be doing with our projects, etc. So we set up something called the think tank, and then from that we formed this group called PART, etc. And we began to argue that there was a few, you know, other ways they could be thinking about their kind of role and what they were actually undertaking. One of which was to, and you probably can't see this very well either, because so we said, well, actually, let's not think about this so much of the buildings. Let's think about this as a kind of an urban setting. So this is the old town of Birzeit. There's a new town of Birzeit over here to the left, which has got the relocated university and all that kind of stuff. But this is the older town. So we said, well, actually, could we start to do different forms of kind of analysis? So we began to encourage them to look not so much at the buildings as objects in themselves, but could they start to look at the ways in which the people who were living there, and these were generally seen as the non-desirable poorer areas within this. If you've got any money at all, and there is some money in the West Bank, etc., through the trade with Israel. But generally people build new houses and sort of move out of this area. So we said, well, look at the people who are still living there, generally the very poorest citizens, and then how do they actually use this? So we started to do an idea of social mapping. So we said, well, let's look at the daily lives of people. The architecture would come from thinking about how people lived in their buildings and in their streets in their daily life. Incidentally, one of the first things they said to us when we had this big meeting, they said, oh, should we get Zaha Hadid in to design us a building? So that was really what they thought they could do. If they got some money, if they got Zaha Hadid, people would notice us. If people would see us, we'd be on the map, sort of thing. And we said, well, actually, we don't think that's probably a very good idea. It's not that kind of project, and we don't know whether that actually really will get to the heart of your kind of problems. It might be an easy image, but it might not be there. So we were trying to get them to think about other ways of thinking about this, and we said, well, think about the kind of social context, think about how people live in the streets, etc. And could you do? And this we were taking very clearly from the experience of Barcelona and other kind of cities we know where the idea of turning around the logic of regeneration, of redevelopment by looking first at the public space rather than the buildings, etc. We said, well, why don't you start doing that here? So we got them, encouraged them to do that, etc. So we said, well, actually, the first thing you should do is take this area, instead of just putting your rather scarce money into the buildings. So let's redesign the urban realm. So we redesigned the kind of the streets and the squares, etc., and put in lighting, etc. And then we said that this would actually then start to create spaces, and we created squares and openings where we realised there was existing cafes and existing meeting points and businesses, etc. So we said, well, let's use those as the kind of the things there as well. So this was done there as well. So this is about regenerating. Then the buildings came from that, etc. And then they started to build some other things. And these designs, we weren't really involved in the designs. We said that's very much what they do. They're the body on the ground. They've got the local kind of experience. It's not for us to come and tell them how really to design, but we help them with kind of the overall concepts, etc. The redesign, by the way, they put it in and it won an Aga Khan award. So I mean, this is the first time a Palestinian building got an award, etc. This is another aspect. We got them to look at the environmental performance of the buildings. We said, well, actually, if you're in a situation in the West Bank whereby Israeli companies control all the electrics, water, etc., and then basically charge the Palestinian residents for 7 times what they charge the settlers and the legal settlements on the West Bank, etc. If you're in a situation like this, it's your duty really to start to think about reducing energy consumption. So we got them to start thinking about energy consumption. And also very much part of that was also about skilling up the labour force. So this is very much seen as a way of creating employment. Sorry, that was my own time on there. There as well. And then we've also been carrying out speculative projects for what other things might be ways of dealing with the overlooking and have you as well. And this is just some quick images from Yara Shari's PhD, just to give you also this kind of sense of her, as well as dealing with these more practical projects, also trying to reimagine the territory, etc. The West Bank's been dug up really severely at the moment. The West Bank is generally disappearing, a lot of it, because it's been dug up to produce stone. It gets then used to turn Jerusalem into the city of stone. And so there's this kind of huge, quite often kind of sort of illegal kind of quarrying of things there. So Yara started to imagine, well, what happens if you've got these huge big craters in the ground, this great despoilation, and could you then start to imagine the reoccupation of this for local community groups? So these are some of the projects that she came up with. I'm sorry, again, you can't see it very well, but she thought of this idea of maybe a great problem is access to water, and this wouldn't provide drinking water, but it would provide lots and lots of grey water. Could you actually, whenever there is rain, and it does rain there, but generally it goes down to the aquifer, gets piped off, gets sold back to the Palestinians by Israeli companies. Could you actually insert kind of devices that could collect grey water and be tapped off, etc., and provide residents with a kind of way of getting their own access to at least the grey water that would help to reduce their water consumption as well. So that's what we're doing there. We're also doing exhibitions. So this is from our Palestine Pavilion we designed for the Cultural Olympics, or the 2012 Olympics. We're going to be doing one later this year for the Calandia Biennale in London, etc. And I'll just finish up here with the kind of, if that's okay, John, I'll just go through these this final slide, etc. So these are the kind of work we've been doing in Palestine, etc. But these are the sort of things that strikes me that design research can have, etc. And maybe sort of qualities that we could start to encourage more in the possession here. The first of all is this idea that it's open-ended and speculative nature, and therefore it's self-reflective rather than conceptually complete. So it's always kind of leaving itself open with room to negotiate, etc. Secondly, it seeks to resist economic and political instrumentality. And I think this is really quite important. We're seeing ever more these attempts to try and make research, shall we say, politically conformable, etc., and to government policies, etc. You probably know the stories, I won't go through them. Thirdly, it's often critical of existing social conditions and power structures, so it has this ability to form a critique, which again other forms of research maybe don't. The four, it mixes text, drawings, models, photographs, etc., in a fluid, creative and dialectical process. So this is kind of an aspiration for it as well. Fifth, it welcomes cross-disciplinary research and blurred boundaries, and again I think that's maybe why it ties in well with the course that is running here. And first of all, sixth, it wishes to resist definitions of easy definitions of normative readings, etc. So there's something in itself that wants to form a constant critique. And I think if you look at the kind of architects I've been talking about from Cedric Price onwards, that's really kind of pretty much what they're doing. And it seems to sort of allow a kind of a dynamic intellectual space for us to operate within. Okay, thank you very much.